Hi, I'm Curt Hinson, and welcome to my expatriate management briefing between Mexico and the United States. This is a presentation geared toward the expatriate United States manager who is moving over to take over a unit in a Mexican company in Mexico and has to assimilate to their culture. We're going to be covering in this presentation a brief introduction to the country of Mexico, a comparison of Mexico to the United States based on the Tropinar's 7 dimensions of culture model, the similarities and differences between Mexico and the United States in regards to communication, motivation, and teamwork within a business organization structure. And we're going to view all these similarities and differences through a Christian lens. Now, the country of Mexico borders the United States on the southwest, borders 4 states, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. The population is around 121 million. Most of them speak Spanish. About 92.5% speak Spanish. There's a few other indigenous languages sprinkled in there. Ethnically, you have the American, Indian, and Spanish mix there. They're called the mestizos at 62%. And then you have the Amerindians. The group is predominantly Amerindians, and that's 21%. And then you have the pure Amerindians at 7%. And then the balance is made up of mostly Europeans. Religious culture there is Roman Catholic is going to be the majority there at almost 83%, and then you have some other denominations sprinkled in throughout. Now we are using the Tropinar's 7 dimensions of culture model, and so we're going to be looking at each of the dimensions individually. First, we're going to look at universalism versus particularism. This is what's more important, following the rules or the relationship. Now, the United States scored 75% on this. Now, as a reminder, in the Tropinar's model, in the surveys they send out, they present several questions and they're dilemmas, and you are to answer the question either A or B, and depending on your answer, you're either answering more to the universalism side, to the rule following side, or to particularism in this case, that you need to look at everything as an individual case scenario. And in some cases, the relationship would trump the rules. Not surprisingly, Americans are a little bit more engaged in rule following, whereas in Mexico, there's about a 50-50 split here in universalism versus particularism. And what that tells me is that that their decisions in these scenarios are based on the circumstances. So in some cases, the rules are more important to follow, and in other cases, the relationship is more important. Next, we look at individualism versus communitarianism. Are the needs of the self and of the individual more important, or are the needs of the community, the group, more important? Again, not surprisingly, America scored higher on the individualism side, whereas Mexicans were much more communitarianism. Their values are going to be based on the needs of the many, the needs of the group, the community. How are relationships viewed? Most people have several interpersonal relationships between their work and their home and maybe church and some other groups they might be involved in. And if you keep all of those segmented and separated, insulated from each other, you'd be more specific. And not surprisingly, again, the United States is overwhelmingly leans towards the specific side. Relationships are kept separate. They're not mingled together. Mexico, on the other hand, is much more diffuse. Those personal relationships are going to overlap between the workplace and personal. Is it okay to show emotion in the workplace? If you would say no, you need to keep your emotions in check and keep those hidden, then you are neutral. If you believe it's okay you should be free to express your emotions in the workplace, then you're effective. Again, we have a big difference here. The United States is much more neutral, hiding their emotions, keeping everything in check, whereas Mexican culture allows for much more freedom as far as expressing emotions. How does one achieve status? Well, you can either achieve it, you can earn it, or it can be ascribed to you. It's given to you based on factors like age, gender, race, your level of education, and the like. Now, the United States, much more at a higher rate, believes that you have to earn the respect, you have to earn your status. Whereas in Mexico, it's a little bit more towards the ascribed side, meaning you're given that respect based on some of those demographic type factors. As far as how time is viewed, if you view time as a series of linear passing events one at a time, then you lean towards the sequential. If you believe that it's all intermingled. You have things happen simultaneously. You're able to multitask. You have things going on at the same time. Past, present, and future are all interconnected. Then you'd be more synchronic. Now, Mexico tends to be more synchronic. They multitask. They might be slower at getting an individual task completed, but they have multiple balls in the air at the same time. Whereas Americans tend to work on one project and see it through to completion. This one's a little bit surprising. If you are internally oriented, that means you believe you can control your surroundings, your environment. You can control nature, impose your will on it. If you are more external, that means that nature happens, the environment happens around you, and you have to just work within that realm. Now, the reason it's surprising is it is not surprising that in the United States they're much more internal. People believe that they can control their environment and they're in control of their own destiny. However, it is even more so internal in Mexico. We're going to switch gears now and move into the portion where we give tips to that American who's going to be moving over to Mexico to take over a business unit there. Give them some tips on how they can better communicate, motivate, and breed teamwork. Now, for the universalist manager, the rule-following manager moving into a culture that is much more, the relationship is viewed as more important than rules in most cases. You need to remember that you need to start building informal networks and create private understandings with your subordinates. You also want to modify relations so that with them so that you can modify the system through those relationships. And if you pull any levers, you want to do so privately. And you want to also make sure that you're seeking fairness by treating everybody as an individual case based on its own merits, not lumping them together. Now, for that individualist manager moving into a communitarian culture, you want to make sure that you are focusing on things like morale and cohesiveness and the team. You want to have low job turnover. You want to avoid showing any kind of favoritism, and you want to extol the entire group, and you want to hold up those subordinate goals for everyone to meet as a group rather than as having individuals recognized. Now, remember that specific oriented manager is going into a diffuse culture. So you want to make sure that the private and business issues you be prepared for the fact that they're going to interpenetrate, they're going to overlap. You want to consider the employee's entire situation before you judge them. And remember that ambiguous and vague instructions are seen as allowing subtle and responsive interpretations through which the employee can exercise personal judgment. You're giving them a little bit of freedom to work on their own. And you also want to make sure if you have a report that you end that with a concluding overview. You also want to remember that you're moving into an effective culture. If you're that neutral manager, want to hold your emotions to yourself. Don't be put off your stride if you are noticing that your subordinates are going to create scenes. They're going to go into histrionics. You also want to make sure that when that happens, they make a scene. You want to take time out to reflect and make a hard assessment, but do that after the fact, after everything has cooled down. Also, if they're expressing goodwill, they're reaching out to you. You want to respond to that warmly. Their enthusiasm, their readiness to agree, or even their strong disagreement does not mean that they have made up their minds. And remember that the negotiation is focused on you personally, not so much on what you're even talking about. Since they're an ascribed-oriented culture, you're going to receive respect as the manager based on the fact that you're going to walk in the door and be the senior man when you walk in the door. Also, pay for performance doesn't work as well there. You want to have rewards that are for everyone, and again, as the team, for the whole team to meet rather than make those goals for the team rather than for the individuals. And because they're more synchronic oriented, remember that they're going to be able to multitask. The whole history of the company and its future potential in the context of their current performance is how things are viewed. They're looking at everything as a whole, because remember, past, present, and future are all connected. It's not what did you do today, what did you do yesterday. It's all, you want to look at their performance as a body of work. And then the internal oriented versus external oriented, remember that's the one where the environment is controlling you or you're controlling it. They are even more internally oriented than the United States are. So this one won't be too hard to adapt to, but you want to make sure that you're looking at their goals and you're achieving some sort of congruence over their goals. Everybody's kind of on the same page. They're all shooting for the same type of goals. You want to try to reinforce the current direction to facilitate the work of all the employees. You want to give them time and the opportunity to quietly work through conflicts which are distressing. Okay, now we're going to switch gears one more time. We're going to look at all this information through a Christian lens. Remember, the universalism versus particularism. That's that dimension in the Tropinar's model where you're either a rule follower or you value relationships. When we look at that through a Christian lens, we want to remember that we want to listen to authority and we want to follow rules because that's important. Romans 13:1 tells us, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. That's something that's hard for us to remember sometimes, but even those that are in authority over us, even if we believe that they're wrong, they've been placed there by God, so we need to listen to what they say. We also need to be able to have compassion on other people, and Hebrews 13:16 is a great example of that. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. The reason is the relationships are sometimes more important than the rules with some cultures and others, but we need to remember as Christians, we need to be compassionate where we can, but we also need to remember that the rules are important as well. So there's kind of that balance there. Now, individualism versus communitarianism. Should we be focused on ourselves or focused on others? If you're a Christian, I think you know the answer to this. Philippians 2:4 tells us, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. That doesn't mean that you neglect yourself, that you just forget about yourself and you focus only on other people. But in the process of looking after yourself, you also need to pay attention to the needs of others. Okay, the specific versus diffuse dimension here. This is the one where we're either keeping the relationships separate or we're putting them all together. Now, if we're keeping them compartmentalized, we may be keeping somebody at arm's length because we feel like we're a manager. We don't want to mingle with them. That's the American way. We want to keep that separate in case I've got to get on them for something. But remember, if you keep them at arm's length, you may be missing an opportunity to grow closer to them in a personal type relationship where you have the opportunity to share the gospel. John 15:13 tells us there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. That's just a verse to remind us how important it is to have friends and how important that love for one another is. Also, the neutral versus effective dimension. That's going to be the one about, remember, the showing emotion. Jesus showed great emotion when his friend Lazarus was dead. He came to see him, and we read the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. Jesus wept. He showed emotion. Another good example there could be when the money changers were cheating the people in the temple, and he overturned the tables and showed kind of a righteous anger in that case. And then the achieve versus ascribe. How is status given? Well, where we need to keep our heads and remember as Christians, yeah, people have status. There are some that in our society may be more important than others, but as Christians, we need to remember what Matthew 25:45 says. And he will answer, I tell you the truth, when you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you are refusing to help me. Jesus said those very words. So we need to remember that everybody deserves our respect and our love, and in doing so, we're going to be honoring Christ through that. In relation to how we view time, we might be more sequential, we might be more synchronic. I don't think one is better than the other, but we do need to remember that our time is precious. It is given to us by God, and we need to be smart about how we use it. Now, Ephesians 5:15-17 tells us, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. We need to know what God's will is for our life. We need to seek him and understand that and use our time to glorify him. In regards to controlling our environment, we may feel like we have the ability or the desire to control that, but we need to remember that God is really the one who's in control of all things. Isaiah 45:6-7 tells us, the people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. God is in charge, and we need to remember that. I hope you've learned something through this. If you were an American manager heading over to Mexico to go to work in a company there, that this would help you assimilate with the culture. I would also encourage you, there's a lot more information covered in these slides than what was available here, so I'd recommend printing those out and taking those with you. Have a great day and God bless.